I'm Lady Smith, Chair of the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry. Today, I publish my 16th volume of case study findings. They relate to the provision of residential care for children at Fettes College in Edinburgh. The school was established in 1870 using funds from the estate of Sir William Fettes, and it was to follow the model of other boarding schools in both Scotland and England. Fettes was, until 1972, a boys-only boarding school for both fee-paying pupils and recipients of bursaries and scholarships. The first female day pupils started in 1972, and Fettes became fully co-educational in 1983. Accounts of life at Fettes until the end of the 1980s were remarkably consistent. Living conditions were basic, and day-to-day responsibility for keeping order fell on senior pupils, while staff were remote with limited, if any, oversight. Boarding houses were the fiefdoms of each housemaster. The character of an individual house depended on its housemaster, with some of them conferring too much power on house prefects and affording inadequate adult supervision, facilitating an environment where abuse could occur unchecked. Power and responsibility was inappropriately devolved to prefects and senior pupils in an undue adherence to an established system of hierarchy. Rugby mattered too much, and to the extent that pupils were valued according to their prowess in that sport or their lack thereof. In this environment, abuse was able to flourish for decades. Children were sexually abused, they were physically abused, and they were emotionally abused. Members of staff sexually abused children from the 1950s until the 1980s. The perpetrators included a headmaster, Anthony Chevenix Trench, and a teacher, Ian Wares. Ian Wares was 27 years old when he moved to Edinburgh from his home in Cape Town, South Africa, in 1967. He had been working as a teacher at St George's Grammar School in Cape Town, but had resigned from his post on account of incidents of what he referred to as, quote, playing around with small boys, unquote. In the course of his career, the norm became that he was asked to leave teaching jobs quietly on account of similar incidents. He arrived in Edinburgh in 1967, having been referred to Professor Henry Walton, consultant psychiatrist at the Royal Edinburgh Hospital, by a South African consultant, with a view to, quote, curing, unquote, him of what is described in the medical records as, quote, homosexuality, liking for young boys, unquote, and, quote, personality disorder, dependent type, unquote. Wares was employed as a teacher in Edinburgh between 1968 and 1979, first at the Edinburgh Academy and then at Fettes. He was not, quote, cured, unquote. Rather, he was a prolific abuser of children. He preyed on them. He had a predilection for touching young boys sexually that he couldn't control. At times, he couldn't control his temper either, resulting in children being subjected by him to brutal assaults. Professor Walton was the consultant in charge of Wares' treatment for many years. Many children were harmed by Wares, and many are still suffering the effects of his abuse, which was appalling, both in its nature and in its extent. Children suffered dreadfully. They were failed by Henry Walton, who knew that Wares was abusing children and that his dangerous predilections were never cured. Walton wholly failed to prioritise the protection of children and failed to lead his team appropriately. He insisted that Wares should continue to teach children despite his ongoing paedophilia, despite him not being cured of his problems, and despite both his wife and his GP making it clear they thought Walton was being utterly irresponsible in doing so. Although Fettes resolved to dismiss Wares in 1975, they kept him on in their employment as a teacher until 1979. The children were wholly failed by the schools. They could readily have been protected from Wares, and it's shameful that that did not happen. Had complaints been listened to and acted upon at the outset, many children would have been saved from abuse in the 1970s. The suffering they still endure over 50 years later in the 2020s could all have been prevented. Anthony Chevenix-Trench was appointed as head of Fettes, having previously been head of Eton College. Fettes hoped that appointing a man who had been head of Eton would enhance its reputation. He was, in fact, a man who was unfit to be appointed to lead a school on account of his having lost the trust of senior masters at Eton, having a problem with drink, and having a propensity to beat boys excessively. He was appointed despite these matters having been expressly disclosed to Fettes by Eton. Chevenix-Trench was also attracted to young blonde teenagers at Eton, a predilection of which the provost of Eton College was aware. He protected 2 and possibly more members of staff who had, to his knowledge, abused children at Fettes. He wrote references which lacked candour. Children were physically abused at Fettes by both teachers and by other children. Corporal punishment was not brought to an end at Fettes until 1986, and prior to that, it was apt to be used inappropriately and without justification. Physical abuse by other boys was rife throughout the boarding houses. Older boys relentlessly assaulted younger ones. They put them through abusive and sometimes dangerous initiation ceremonies, and rabbling, a form of play fighting, often escalated into real violence. Attacks, as one applicant described them, were impossible to predict and unprovoked. There was a culture of silence. Children feared retribution and being ostracized if they complained. Emotional abuse of children by other children was common. Bullying by mocking or belittling, usually because a child was different in some respect, was endemic at Fettes for decades. It could, for example, be based on physique, demeanour, accent, or sporting ability, and could be prompted by homophobia. For some, it was unrelenting and remorseless. When Fettes had to investigate allegations of illegal drug use by pupils in 1992, the processes employed to do so were abusive. Following the introduction of coeducation, female pupils were the targets of serious and regular misogyny, which persisted into the 21st century. Female pupils were treated as second-class citizens in a way that was tolerated by the school. Complaints about the misogynistic treatment of girls were made by and on behalf of girls, but the school's response was poor, as the current head accepted. Racism was prevalent at Fettes well into the 21st century. Mocking by staff and pupils of anyone who wasn't British was normalised into the 1990s. Black or Asian pupils experienced violence or threats of violence from other pupils, and some staff and pupils were also prejudiced against those who were English. There were, nonetheless, children throughout the period covered in the evidence who were not abused and had positive experiences at the school, which to this day they value. Recent leaders have reflected carefully since their first response to the inquiry in 2017, at which time they did not accept that there were any systemic failures. They now acknowledge that there were shortcomings at Fettes in decades long past, as well as more recently. The current head of Fettes apologised on behalf of the school for the abuse experienced by children entrusted into its care. Applicants and other witnesses continue to come forward to the inquiry with relevant evidence about boarding schools, and this will be considered as part of a continuing process. I would encourage anyone who has relevant information on any aspect of our work to get in touch with our witness support team. Thank you.